So first, a couple of words about the center where you are today. The Eurogulf Information Center is almost 2 years old. We're based here in Rome, and we're mainly interested in relations between Europe and the Gulf countries, and by extension, the entire Middle East. Given that Gulf countries, and by that we mean the GCC countries, Iraq and Iran, are becoming increasingly important actors in the entire neighborhood. So what we do is dissemination and trying to bring the two parties together, so countries in Europe and countries in the Gulf and the wider Arab world. And we do that by events that we host sometimes here, sometimes for bigger events in bigger venues in Italy and in thorough Europe. But also we arrange exchanging visits and delegations in both regions, so Europe and the Gulf and the wider Middle East. And of course we do publications, smaller publications which are on the website, and longer publications which you can find both on the website and around here in hard copies. So today we are very lucky that we have, I think, three very interesting speakers that will address some of the main challenges in the Arab world. So from the far end of the table, Ambassador Guido Lenzi, a former diplomat of Italy's and also a professor at the University of Bologna. Then at the center you have Professor Mitchell Belfer, who is the president of the Eurogulf Information Center and has a very, very extensive experience in the GCC specifically. And then next to me, close to me, Dr. Umberto Profazio, who is a expert on Libya and wider North Africa, and he's now based in London, cooperating with IISS and NATO Defense College Foundation. So I think, without further ado, I will clarify just very quickly what is the format of our events, which is often the same. So we do a first part where our speaker have 10 minutes each to talk to you and present their ideas. And then in the second part of the event, we try to have very interactive events. So you are all very welcome to make your points, ask questions, and comments. And also the speakers themselves will interact with one another. So the interactive part is our favorite part. And my role will just be of moderating. My name is Cinzia Bianco, and I focus as well on the GCC, the Gulf, and the wider Arab world, but more specifically on the Gulf. So I think we can start maybe from Ambassador Guido Lenzi. Please.
What should I be talking about?
So I think what they were thinking of asking you is Italy's role in the Middle East, but more specifically in the context of post-ISIS world, yeah. So after the terrorist groups.
Broad enough.
Huh?
Yeah, that's right. I think the microphone. For you to hear me. Do you hear me? There are some seats up here, so if you can't hear me, even with the microphone, come up and sit on the side or on the front. There are seats up here. Can you hear me? Col microfono?
No, I think that this is more for recording.
Oh, this is for recording. Okay, so so I will have to speak loudly. In 10 minutes, of course, what I have been asked to speak to you about is an impossibility. Obviously, it's much too broad a topic. So I will try to give you some basic elements. Pinpoint some of the basic elements that diplomacy in general, and also think tankers and researchers, and of course firms are trying to connect. What is difficult at the present moment in the Middle East and the Arab world in general is establishing the connections between the various elements that are clear enough for everybody to see, but the interconnection of these elements are still quite vague. You may say the same thing about Italy in general, so this is not a judgment. Italy also has very clear things that you can pinpoint, but our politicians themselves are having a hard time trying to establish the interconnect. So it is a general problem. Now, the first thing to say is that we speak of MENA countries, Middle East and North Africa, and that is an easy slogan, but it is misleading. You have the Middle East, that is one reality, and the Northern African Arab world, which is a completely different reality. Both historically, ethnically, geographically, even during the Ottoman Empire, the northern African countries or nationalities had a different status. They were run not directly by Istanbul, but they were run by local beys, etc., and they had their own policy, of course, related to the empire. But I mean, they were not as closely. Whereas the Middle East was constructed, established 100 years ago by the famous Sykes-Picot after the First World War. And the Europeans, French and Brits, tried to divide that area, which was an indistinct, non-distinct Ottoman territory, into specific countries, trying to construct states where no states had existed. Lawrence of Arabia, all of that, we know all of that. And that is very clear about it. You had tribes, and the Europeans, after the French and the Brits, the Italians were also involved, but decided very soon that it was best for them to deal with Libya and not get involved in the dividing up the Ottoman Empire. So countries were produced after the First World War, which had not existed before. But they were indispensable. Some say, oh, but we did that with a ruler, etc. Yes, of course, but that's how you establish states in lands where there are no clear geographical distinctions. The American states have been drawn, the Middle East, by a ruler, and you can see that in Africa it's the same thing. There is no other way to construct a territory, which is an essential element for a state. So, because of the mandate from all of this is done, so I will not belabor or detail about it. So, the problem is that ever since the Sykes-Picot and the post-war arrangements, the Arab states in the area, in the Middle East, not the North Africa, but in the Middle East, have had to grapple with the problem of establishing a state. And there are here representatives of this country who can tell us more about how this process actually developed. And they tried in various ways. They tried by mimicking us with the secularization, like Atatürk had done in Turkey, of their societies. They tried with Arab socialist policies, Nasser, for example. They tried to establish relations among themselves, but it was a difficult process, and a process that has not yet been established. I repeat, it's a European talking. You could tell me that Europeans themselves have not yet established a relationship among them. So I mean, it's a general problem, but it is a problem that affects particularly that part of the world. What has happened is that Pan-Arabism never developed in the area. That's another important problem. The Egyptians tried to establish a Egyptian-Syrian union. Can't remember exactly what it was called. With the Egyptians tried with Yemen as well. It didn't work. It lasted a year or so. They didn't work because these are different nations, different mentalities, and so on. Besides, many of these rulers were imported from Arabia. You know, we all know how these countries were established. So what has happened, what continues to happen in the region, instead of a process of cooperation, you have a fight for hegemony. There are countries that have tried to establish the hegemony there, the leaders. The Egyptians were the most obvious ones for historical and other reasons. Then you had Saddam Hussein, who obviously tried to do the same thing. At a certain point, Saddam Hussein, when Khomeini arrived in Iran, a non-Arab, a Shiite, etc., as we know, so a different type of big country in the area. The Iraqis with Saddam Hussein tried to establish their hegemony in the area. And there were a series of actions which have been forgotten, like, for example, the war with Iran, the war with the aggression of Kuwait, the gassing of the Kurds in the northern part, we all remember that, the persecutions of the Shiites in the south, Karbala and the southern regions, the missiles against Israel, etc. It was a series of acts, of forceful acts, that disturbed the actors in the region. That is basically why the so-called West tried to intervene and to stabilize the area, which had been destabilized by Khomeini before, by Iraqis afterwards, etc. The story about nuclear arms, not nuclear arms, yes, we can talk about it, but I mean, that was not the main problem. I believe that the Arab countries in the area were grateful to the Americans for getting rid of a leader. I'm being very frank because I'm not a diplomat anymore. I tried to be a diplomat, but I'm retired, so I'm trying to think out aloud. I'm thinking out aloud. I'm not giving you answers. But I believe that that was the reason why the West tried to intervene. Badly, etc., as we want. But that is the story of Iraq, in a sense. So the Americans and others did a favor to the countries in the area. Saudi Arabia, for example, who was very worried about Saddam Hussein, Iraq, of course, Iran, of course, etc. Now, the issue, and I think my time is almost over, so I will try to try to come. What do we do with it? What does the European Union do with it? What can the Europeans do with it? What we have to do is to recreate cooperation, not only reconciliation between the various, after all these wars and difficulties, but also a reconstruction of the state structures in the states and between the states, institutional structures. The Arab League is some kind of a place where, by the way, the Secretary General is a good old friend of mine, Abu Ghait, Ahmed Abu Ghait, if I'm not mistaken. He was ambassador in Rome, by the way, among other things. So try to reconstruct an international, pan-Arab cooperation system structure, and of course reconstruct the states. How do you these two, internal and external reconstruction of the area, of the institutional political framework of the area, is what we call in Europe a federalization. Federalizing, ensuring that both within the state, in Iraq in particular, and among the states, there is some kind of greater autonomy for the local identities, Kurds, Shiites, Sunnis, etc. Syria is another case in point. Syria has to be reconstructed in a federal way. There has been an example which is working in the area, and that is Lebanon. Lebanon is a federal state, as we all know. I will not dwell into that. Has been set up as a federal. It's working out well. You have the three components. That is not a recipe that we are proposing, that the international community is proposing only to the area. The Balkans is exactly the same thing. In the Balkans, we're trying to reconstitute, recompose, reconnect the various things on a federal basis, like the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia existed before. It has been destroyed. It has to be. What are the Europeans trying to do? Refine the federal setup of the European Union. It's the only way in which in the world, in today's world, global world, open communication, what you call it, Arab Spring and so forth, they have developed this all the wars, etc. The only way to recover. Now and I finish, what can the European Union do about this? Little, for as long as the area is beset with conflicts, because the European Union is not and does not want to be constitutional. Genetically, the European Union is not a war military machine. The European Union has renounced the military instrument of national affirmation, in particular between France and Germany, etc. We know the story. So what the European Union can do is propose to the others the things that we have done we're trying to do for ourselves. We're not imposing, we're not giving to that area a different recipe for overcoming its traumatism, etc., than the one that we have been adopting ourselves. Yet again, Europe was destroyed by 2 world wars. I mean, who are we to teach you a lesson? Anybody a lesson? We're submitting to you the very same recipe, the very same cure that we have, and we're still trying to adopt ourselves: federalization. The European Union has tried with Barcelona, as you very well know, the Barcelona process, but that was stopped because at the time Israel still constituted a stumbling block. It's not so anymore. Israel is not as much of a stumbling block now as it was 10, 15 years ago. Then there was the 5+5, and Sarkozy tried to do this Union pour la Méditerranée, etc., trying to extract the western part of the Mediterranean, because the western part of the Mediterranean is different in its compositions, in its requirements, in its structure, as I said, etc. So we should try, and European Union can deal better with Northern Africa, also because of the migration
Thank
issues.
you very much. I will jump in at this moment, and I think you will have
but
more...
no, but that is all I had to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I will jump in at this moment because you raised, I think, 2 of the crucial points that the other speakers will also take into consideration. The first point that you raised is the reconstitution and rebuilding of the regional model. But I think now we will hear from Professor Belfer about the latest challenge to this idea, which is the GCC crisis. And even a bloc of 6 countries that we thought was soundly together in one organization now is turning against one another. And then after that, we will hear from Dr. Profazio about the second point that the ambassador raised. So how the importance of rebuilding a country internally, and he will address specifically the case of Libya, which is, I think, a case in point about that. So thank you very much. Please.
So first, ladies and gentlemen, I have to admit I feel quite a little bit like a middle child. Not being able to do the introduction and not being able to do the conclusion. My job essentially is to build a bridge between them. And I'm going to do that from the position both as the president of this association, but more as somebody who's reflecting and been reflecting on the Gulf for quite some time, but more importantly for me, because in the last number of years I've settled here in Italy, I feel confident enough to also be able to speak at least a little bit on behalf of Italy. Why is that? I mean, how is it that after just 2 short years you can speak on behalf of Italy? The answer is very easy. Italy belongs in the community of Europe, and many of the foreign policy additives that Italy has been pursuing over the past years are a reflection of European interest and European strategic identity, or Europe's strategic identity. And so in this way, it's very important for me at the very beginning, and I'll reiterate this a little bit later on, when we look at Italy's or Italian foreign policy, we could do Italy / the European Union as one kind of actor in the Mediterranean. There are differences. Of course, Italy, being situated in the in the Mediterranean, has a different perspective about Mediterranean politics than, for example, the United Kingdom or Germany or the Scandinavian countries. And that is very clear for everybody when you see how watered down European foreign policy is. It's supposed to match the strategic interests of the south of Europe, the north of Europe, and very importantly, the east of Europe. And so it's a very complicated set of challenges that Europe has itself in identifying the challenges it has to face. Now that has not made, or it's not been made any easier by the crisis after crisis after crisis that are coming out of the Middle East. I mean, you know, if you took Europe by itself and you stuck it into a, let's say, hermetically sealed jar, they would still have problems in trying to determine a foreign policy. Now throw Europe into the world and it becomes almost impossible, especially when we talk about one of the most, I would think, vulnerable regions on Earth. A region that, as Mr. Ambassador had just indicated, a region that's still going through its growing pains of learning who it is, in terms of identity, ideology, the contours, the very basis of the state itself. And so when you have all these problems that are coming from the Middle East into a region like Europe that is supposed to be united somehow in developing a foreign policy, you have almost like a suspended animation to a degree. So let's say at the very beginning of this, I would like really to point out that Italy is a very important European actor, representing, even in some cases, the front line of some of the challenges that Europe as a whole faces. We see this very recently with the immigration crisis. Italy is on the front line of this. So my opinions that I'm going to raise here today are not really, I'm not speaking, if we could turn off my role for the censor and we can just think about me as a professor of international politics, that's where my ideas are coming from. And I try my best not to let my personal views also interfere with the way that the center is directed, but you know, sometimes it's inevitable, but what can you do? I do my best. This is me talking as Mitchell Belfer, not me as, you know, the chief of the center. Now, at the beginning of this past summer in 2017, I think it was just at the beginning of June in 2017, the international community was hit by yet another crisis that comes out of the Gulf. This time it was different. It wasn't ISIS. It wasn't Iran. It didn't even involve the United States. Okay, this time it was only about the Gulf Cooperation Council countries having what seems to everybody as an internal problem. So you have the GCC countries, I will refer to them for the rest of today's talk as the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. We can go into details about this later, but in a very short way, it's the six, so Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman form the Gulf Cooperation Council. It was formed in 1981, and it's had crises before. This is not the first one, but this is the most, let's say, most recent, and it's also having the largest impact, I think, on the region and by extension also in Europe. Now, I think it's important for us also to correct the misnomer. Some people refer to it as the Qatar crisis. It's not the Qatar crisis. If we were to refer to it as the Qatar crisis, then what we would be looking at is a crisis over Qatar. It's not a crisis over Qatar. It's a crisis about the Gulf region itself. It's about the direction that the Gulf region is taking. It's about turning a page on what the Gulf region was and looking into the future as to what the Gulf region is trying to emerge into being. Mm-hmm. And there are different forces, energies at play. Some of them are very progressive and are looking into the future. Others are more, let's say, less progressive, let's say, instead of more. They're less progressive and they're either trying to stay put and in some cases pull us back into a kind of imagined past or an imagined history. Now, before getting into some of the main arguments that I'd like to raise today, I also would like just to maybe pause a little bit and further reflect on Italian foreign policy in the sense of how the Gulf crisis now involving Qatar, not focused on, but involving Qatar, how it potentially can affect all of Europe in general. Now, first, just to reiterate a word on Italy, Italy is a middle power. It's not a great power, but it's certainly not a small power. It's a middle power, and from my point of view, it's quite effective in its middle powermanship here in the Mediterranean region. But as a result of its effectiveness, it also has certain stakes that are deeply, let's say, connected to regional stability. Italy, just like the rest of Europe, Italy requires a stable Mediterranean region. And guess what? we don't have stability in the Mediterranean region. We don't have it in Libya. We don't have it in Syria. Israel and Palestine is certainly not a place of stability. Egypt is not a place of stability, neither is Tunisia. Turkey also is not a point of stability at this point in time. So basically, Italy does have a stake in stability, and there is no stability. The other thing to keep in mind is that Italy's main allies in the region, i.e. NATO and the European Union, although they are allies of Italy, they are in some ways restricting Italians' freedom of action because that's the nature of an alliance. Italy cannot pursue all of the interests that it wants to in the region because its allies have other interests. So Italy cannot enforce or create new alliances in the region that may produce stability for it. So it has to think in many ways for non-Mediterranean states, right? The other countries that we mentioned north that don't have a border on the Mediterranean Sea. And we see this perfectly in the case of immigration. Italy would deal with immigration much differently if it didn't have to rely and work with its NATO and with its European Union partners. But it does. And so those are the realities. Now, in relation to this, it has to deepen, and I really believe that a deeper Italian relationship to Europe and NATO in this, and in providing security and stability in the Middle East is absolutely essential. Italy couldn't do it alone by itself. Now, what does all this have to do with Qatar? Because in fact, as a middle power, as a country like Italy that has a role to play globally, that's I think what middle powermanship is all about, playing not a decisive role, but a contributing role to global affairs, and Italy certainly does. And Italy has the advantage that it has relations with Iran, with Iraq, with Saudi Arabia, with Bahrain, with Kuwait, with all the countries all around the Gulf. With Egypt, with Israel, and with Palestine. Yeah, but it really, what's amazing is that in its position, Italy doesn't have to carry the historic baggage of other countries in Europe, and Italy really can and has the ability and does have a working relationship with nearly all the countries in the Gulf and frankly in the Arab world. Now, that means when you have such relations, it means that relations can also be disrupted when there's a disruption in the fabric of the relationships that are in the Gulf, in this particular case. Because if, for example, the countries of the Arab Gulf and of the GCC, if they no longer have a transaction between them, it increases the transaction costs between those countries, the third parties that are trying to get involved. For example, it's difficult to deal both with Qatar and with Saudi Arabia right now. And these are choices, I think, and very important ones, that the Italian government, but also Italian civil society, small and medium enterprises, and large enterprises are going to have to make in the future, so long as the crisis continues. Now, what is this crisis that we're referring to? What is it all about? What is, the issue with Qatar? Some people are very quick to accuse accuse the GCC countries of picking on Qatar. Others support Qatar in all this. The reality is, I think, somewhere in between. It's a very nuanced situation that we face in the Gulf. But there's a couple of things that I want to be clear about. Just like, as Mr. Ambassador said earlier, the countries are just kind of emerging as states on their own 2 feet. We also have to realize that in the Gulf, you have a real overlap of people. So there are many people who have intermarried. You don't have a pure person called a Qatari or a pure person called a Saudi or a pure person called, we're talking about tribal societies. We're talking about what do they call, there's a term for it, tribal modern. And you have an emergence of a national character, but all in all, families have overlapped. People from different tribes have married. So you're not talking about the ability of having a clear-cut boundary. So when we talk about the Gulf crisis, we're talking in some ways of a regional crisis. Second, when we talk about a blockade, because this is another one of the narratives that we talk about, there is certainly a boycott right now of 3 of the GCC countries with 1 of the GCC countries. But that doesn't mean that that Qatar is now under complete lockdown. It's not. It still is able to engage in its international affairs. It's only not able to do so with the 3 countries that are boycotting it. So you do have a severing, or let's say a suspension of relations between 3 of the GCC countries and 1, but the other 2 countries, freely trade still with Qatar, as does the international community. So it's important for us to keep that in mind. And the third point, what's going to bleed me into the main arguments of today, although my time is very quickly disappearing. The third one that I want to say is that this is not the first row and the first problem that we've had between Qatar and the other GCC countries. So it's important to contextualize the fact that, and forget the crises that go back 150 years or even 200 years, and just think about the last 20 years. There was a crisis in 1995, there was a crisis in 2013, in 2006, 2013, 14, and there's a crisis now. So the point is that we have to figure out what the crises are about. Because the crises, if they keep recurring, obviously it's something like an enduring rivalry, it's not one-off, and obviously some issues have simply not been solved. And so what we're talking about now basically originates in a platform that Qatar had developed on its own, that in some ways is contrasted with the other GCC countries in relation to foreign affairs. So the other GCC countries, including, by the way, Oman and Kuwait, or less Oman but more Kuwait, have been very much, let's say, seeking a unified foreign policy direction. They're trying to follow a security platform that they can all agree on. Qatar has taken a slightly different route on this, and they've also made some terrible mistakes and I think misjudgments in the kind of groups that they have been supporting. And I think all countries in Europe and the Middle East have made mistakes. The problem, I think, with Qatar is that those mistakes have been repeated. So they were repeated, they were supposed to have been stopped, those practices, after the 2013-14 crisis, but basically they kept going on. And as a result of their continuation, this is why there's been a slight escalation between in 25 seconds. No, not 25 seconds, 2.5 minutes. That's why there's been, in some ways, this, let's say, a deepening of the crisis between the GCC countries themselves. Now, just want to maybe go over those very, very quickly, because essentially what Qatar's foreign policy behavior has kind of led to is a confusion over, let's say, its financing of certain groups that in some ways have bled into terrorist groups. The Muslim Brotherhood is a fine example of this. The Muslim Brotherhood does have a more civil face, but it also has a more terroristic face. And I think it's important to know that some of the groups that Qatar has sponsored do support terrorism. And it's very clear there's a huge amount of evidence behind Qatar's support of certain nefarious terrorist organizations. But also, and it's not only about terrorism, it's also about the geopolitics of the Gulf region. Because in fact, the way that Qatar has responded to this crisis has been to deepen its relationship with Iran is one thing, but to deepen its relationship to Turkey. And it's been a very interesting change in regional geopolitics and regional geoeconomics to have a Turkish naval base inside of Qatar that gets reinforced as this crisis deepens. And this is very important for us here in Europe and in Italy, because Turkey is a NATO member. So what Qatar is showing us is that NATO is maybe about to change its face, because its key member on our Middle Eastern front is changing its orientation and its geopolitical preferences and is working closer with Qatar. Now this is a serious issue for us. And Russia. Today they announced an arms deal with Russia, which was a poke in the eye of NATO because of the interoperability and the deals that they have with NATO. Now, I will wrap up on this, and I hope that we'll be able to talk a little bit about some of the solutions to this during question and answer, but I don't want to detract from our colleague here at the table. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I turn the floor over.
Thank you very much. So as I mentioned, after addressing one of the main challenges to the regional system, which is the GCC crisis, I would like now to hear more about one of the main challenges in state building or rebuilding, which is Libya, and particularly from the Italian perspective. Dr. Profazio, over to you.
Thank you, Cinzia. I would like to thank the Eurogulf Information Center for having me again this year to talk about Libya. As you may imagine, it is really a really complex task outlining Italy's foreign policy in Libya in just 10-15 minutes. I'll try to do my best. because the situation in Libya is still fluid. There are the fragmentation process is still going on, and there are different centers of powers. There are different spoilers who are preventing any reconciliation between the rival factions inside the country, and there is political instability. At the same time, Italy's foreign policy in Libya didn't change too much in the last years, and this confirms some of our considerations we made in this room last year. But it also prevents any reconciliation inside the country. And in the last months, Italy also passed from a position of leadership, in my opinion, to an increasing isolation. In my presentation, I would like to focus on the most recent developments inside the country, because I think that taking an historical approach will be useless. I will thus try to draw your attention on two main important trends inside this country that there could be a possible game changer for Libya in the future, and these are the perceived convergence between the Prime Minister of the GNA, the Government of National Accord, Fayez al-Sarraj, and the General Khalifa Haftar of the LNA, the Libyan National Army. The second factor is the progress of the LNA on the ground. We will also try to speak about the regional initiatives to end the crisis in the country and to make some prediction for the future. Despite having been announced widely, the Paris meeting on July 2017 between Sarraj and Haftar was an unexpected development for the Italian government. It was also welcomed as a significant breakthrough to solve the crisis. We can quickly just recall that it included a ceasefire, the commitment of both parties to all the presidential and parliamentary elections as soon as possible, and the implementation of the Libyan political agreement. Nevertheless, the joint declaration was not binding because neither Sarraj nor Haftar signed it, and it was not specific because it didn't offer a date for the elections. It also offered different loopholes to Haftar, because the ceasefire does not apply to terrorist groups inside the country, and in this category we know that Haftar always tend to include also more moderate Islamist factions. The meeting also offered an international stage to Haftar, strengthening his international legitimacy, and it also weakened Sarraj, creating an unbalanced partnership between the two, in which Haftar is clearly in a dominant position. On the other hand, the meeting also showed how Italy and France are at odds over Libya. The new French President Emmanuel Macron was successful in bringing together the two parties in Paris, and it also confirmed French traditional foreign policy of officially supporting the GNA and Sarraj while substantially backing Haftar and LNA. This course of action is particularly represented by the French Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian, who was the defense minister in the previous administration and who had several contacts with Haftar, and by Frank Paris, who is the presidential advisor for African affairs and is a strict associate of Le Drian himself. On the other hand, Italy has always been a strong supporter of the GNA. We can just remember the Rome conference in December 2015, the first visit by a foreign representative to Sarraj in April 2016 by the then foreign minister Paolo Gentiloni, the Vienna conference in May 2016 co-chaired by the United States and Italy. And in September 2016, Italy also established a military hospital in Misurata to provide urgent care for the fighters of the Operation Buyan al-Marsus to oust the Islamic State, ISIS, from Sirte. However, at the end of last year, the international landscape was about to change. We had political instability in Italy. The Prime Minister Matteo Renzi resigned, and we had also a complex transition in the United States between the former President Barack Obama and the new administration of Donald Trump. This weakened the two main supporters of the GNA and led to a more complex environment. Despite the perceived weakness, Gentiloni stuck to the Italian traditional approach in Libya to support the GNA. It sent the Italian Minister of Interior, Marco Minniti, in January. Minniti announced the establishment, the reopening of the Italian embassy in Tripoli. On 10th January, the Italian ambassador Perrone reopened the embassy, but Italy's efforts didn't produce relevant results. We can only remember a meeting in Rome between the president of the House of Representatives, Aguila Saleh, and the head of High Council of State, Abu Rahman al-Zweli. It is a meager result compared to the Paris meeting. More importantly, Italy increasing isolation was felt when Gentiloni visited Washington in April. In that occasion, the US President Donald Trump said that he didn't see any role for the United States in Libya because the United States had enough role everywhere. Nevertheless, he didn't rule out any further intervention against ISIS. This paved the way for regional powers to intervene in the crisis in Libya. There were a diplomatic initiative of the Libya's neighboring countries, Algeria, Tunisia, and Egypt, that signed Tunis Declaration in February 2017, urging Libyan factions to negotiate between themselves and rejecting any foreign intervention or military solution. Nevertheless, this approach was useless because there was also expectation for a meeting between the summit between the head of state of these three countries that never took place because probably of the faltering health condition of President Abdelaziz, the Algerian President Abdelaziz Bouteflika. Moreover, there was also mistrust between Algeria and Egypt, and this became clear in May. We can talk about these developments later, maybe in the question time. The inability of the neighboring countries to solve the crisis in Libya paved the way for the intervention of regional powers that pursued their interest through an unconventional approach. The Gulf Cooperation Council's crisis had deep reverberations in Libya. We can say that the Eastern government of Abdullah al-Thani severed diplomatic ties with Qatar, accusing it of interference and of supporting terrorist groups in Libya. This measure was criticized by different Islamist factions in the western part of the country. But this internal divide deepened after the publication of a so-called terror list in which the Gulf states included several Islamist representatives. The proliferation of these so-called terror lists suggests implementation of a two-pronged policy in Libya based on delegitimizing Islamist factions inside the country and on the rehabilitation of former figures of the regime of Gaddafi. The case of the release of Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi in Zintan in June is a case in point. I think that I will stop here and maybe we can talk about the most important interests, the strategic and geopolitical interests of Italy in the question time.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So I think I will open up the floor right away for questions. I will apologize in advance for having to leave in a little bit earlier, but you can definitely, I'm sure you will go on very well without me. So I'll now take the first questions. Please raise your hand, and if you like, tell us who you are, and then make your comments or questions about all the themes that you've heard today. So we have one here, another one in the back, and the third one. So please.
Guido Simone, planet360.info. Our journal was analyzing this problem long ago. It's about 2 years of researches that led us to a potential conclusion that one of the possible solutions, and not casually, I think that Italy could be probably the actor proposing something like this, like a bridge, like it is, as a matter of fact.
With Libya.
No, about the general problem of the area, which is just the Mediterranean area.
No, as the whole area.
Including also Libya, of course.
Middle East and Libya.
Yes, because the factors are many. As the complex reality is just made of many factors interfering to all the whole politics of the area. So a potential solution might be a kind of new way to think of a potential cooperation among all the countries in the interest of everybody, which is just the idea of a Medcom, so a Mediterranean community, which is including also the second part of the states just around them, who is just on the waters of with the coast on the Mediterranean Sea is not the only one, of course, because the Mediterranean Sea has always been historically the center of an exchange of anything, from ideas to goods and culture.
Thank you very much.
The cradle of our civilization. Let's not forget.
So the idea is what, according to you, can be the reaction from the different countries, and what about the role of Italy in this case?
To a new project of a Mediterranean community, and what could be the role of Italy in it. Thank you very much. Diego?
Hi. My question is about how the Trump administration's policy toward the Middle East will affect Italian policy toward the region and Italian-American relations in general. We know that Italy is a very important military partner of the United States in the Middle East. It's a very important contributor of troops in notorious trouble spots such as Afghanistan and Iraq, and this is just to name a few. It used to be a very important trading partner of Iran, and it really stands to benefit from a kind of normalization of in progress on the implementation of the Iran nuclear deal. Now, we have heard that the Trump administration since interested in, it has already shown some signs of a willingness to adopt a more muscular policy in the region, and there's talk about renegotiating the Iran deal or scrapping it altogether. So there is important signals of a change in policy toward the region, and my question is addressed to you, the panel in general. What is, in your opinion, how this likely change will affect Italian-American relations?
The Trump factor.
Yeah, the Trump factor is big.
The third question there, yes, then we will maybe provide some answers and then take 3 more questions.
I would like to ask a question related to the general perspective from an European and international point of view. We consider Italy's foreign policy in general. There are some specific point of views and goals that Italy wants to achieve, like stability in Libya, stability in other regions that were, and usually supported by the international community. Like the support given to Sarai is supported by the international community and by the European Union. But at the same time, it seems like that even if there is an superficial, if we can say, support for Italy's actions, at the same time, like France acted by itself, like as was stated before, and usually there's a different current occurrence of actions from the international community and even European states like France. And I wanted to ask, what can be in your opinion, in general, the solution for like to achieve this content are generally agreed on, but not really respected by our own allies.
Thank you. Please, anybody on the panel would like to address a question about the ambitious project for a new Mediterranean community and Italy's potential role in it?
I did not speak about Italy before because there was not enough time. I wanted to point this out very clearly to those, particularly to the foreigners and foreign observers and diplomats who are in Italy. Italy has had a post-war international policy which was established by two automatic pilots, I would say, like in a plane. One of them was NATO. We were founding members of NATO, 1949. And the other was the European Union. We were the founding members of the European Community in 54, 57, etc. We then hung on to those two things, and because of the domestic situation, some of us forget that Italy had one party in government and one party, the Communist Party, in opposition. That constrained enormously even the debate, the discussion about the national interests of Italy. As a matter of fact, I remember until about 10 years ago or so, speaking of an Italian national interest was considered as a fascist endeavor. Italy does not have national interest. Italy has international interest. Italy will do whatever the United Nations will establish. So that what is United Nations? Generally, it includes Russia and the others, etc. So, in terms of actually abiding by what was established by the line that was established by the others, the situation is completely different now because the European Union at 28, 27 is not what it was. The direction don't come from there, and NATO, even NATO is in Afghanistan, which is not. It's an out of area. I mean, it's not an automatic pilot anymore. You have to agree or not agree to send troops like we did to Afghanistan. So we're getting used to that. In Libya, Italy still sticks to Serraj and the Tripoli government because that is what the United Nations has established as the interlocutor of the international community. The United Nations has not come around yet, or whatever, to including Haftar. So there are other more how could you say, leaders who take the initiative. Sarkozy took the initiative on the Union pour la Méditerranée, and I was personally involved in it. Now Macron takes the initiative to get Sarraj and Haftar together. Why? Because we would not have been able to sustain that thing, because Italy does not go out of the path that was established by NATO. We feel secure, we feel protected in that. We don't have to invent anything new. Italy dreads inventing a new path. It could, on the other hand, and I think you mentioned that, it could contribute to promote a policy in the European Union that is complementary to the one in the United Nations, etc. But actually going out on a limb like France has done repeatedly, that is not what Italy is used to do. That is not what Italian foreign policy does. We are faithful and honest and reliable partners. We've always been. We've always been reliable partners of the Western community. Reliable is one thing, audacious is something else.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I think.
Can I just
Jump in? Yes, please.
You have mentioned two factors which guided the Italian policy, which is the European Union and the NATO. What about the American factor?
Oh, that was the question that was raised back there by somebody. That is another extremely important factor. Italy, especially the youngsters, please study the Italian policy in this post-war period. It was different from the other Western countries. Italy always found in America the counter insurance to the European Union. When things became shaky in the European Union, and we didn't know exactly where we were going to, whether we were, for example, the euro and other issues like that, we always turned to America as the big brother, may I say that word, you know what I mean, as our good partner who would ensure that Italy's position was taken into account in the European Union. It was the counter insurance when the going got rough in the European Union. Don't forget that it was the Americans who wanted us in the French, Canadians, etc. in NATO in the first place in 1949. So yes, America is an extremely important. I told you about these two things. NATO means America, and European Union means European Union. So we've been shifting between the one and the other. I mean, so America is. What will Trump do? Is that Trump is not a reliable partner anymore for us. So we are in a difficult position.
Thank you very much. I think you gave some essential ideas that someone should always keep in mind when thinking about Italy's foreign policy. So thank you very much for that. Anybody on the panel wants to address that?
Yeah,
yes,
sure. In short, like a Mediterranean community, I totally agree with it in principle. I think it's something that would be beneficial for everybody on all sides of the Mediterranean. But I have like a kind of threshold, like or maybe an example about Europe and European integration, about how difficult it's been to integrate, for example, Poland or Bulgaria and Romania, which still are not active members of Schengen space. And or even the singular currency, the euro, it's just been so difficult to integrate some European Union members into a European Union that exists already for many, many decades. And so I think that in theory it's a very, very good idea. But I think we are so far away from it. We haven't reached the amount of time of stability, of economic growth, of adjusting the different sects within some countries, in adjusting the different kind of heritage that people have of even conflicting one another, to put them together into a framework. They haven't, and I know this is going to sound so harsh, but they didn't experience World War II. And because they didn't experience World War II, where the great hegemons were smashed down and a new kind of order was established, they're not at the point yet, because there hasn't been the great defeat. And I think until there's the great defeat, and I hope we don't need to experience that. I hope that over a longer period of time, instead of the all at one, 7 years of warfare brings a whole new world order together. Instead of having that, you have a more gradual but longer period of this kind of adjustment. That's my reflection on that point. Trump, to echo Mr. Ambassador, Trump is in some ways a wild card in this. It's true, because he is an unreliable partner, democratically elected over a polity that is unreliable. And I think he's not the cause of the problem, he's a symptom of the problem, of a growing disenchantment of the United States with itself, and by extension of it having a problem with itself, it's bleeding out into foreign policy. I want to just maybe remark for 1 second on the idea of Trump and Iran. I don't know, for example, that any other president would be any different, however. Trump has his own approach, so to speak, but I think when it comes to Iran, Iran is abiding by a part of the nuclear deal, but it's also violating another part of the nuclear deal, which is in relation to its ballistic missile testing. And I think that if Iran was a serious partner in this program, it would also have given up its ballistics program and not have confronted the West in the way it has, by basically flaunting its missile program, knowing that America would never get the support in Europe for breaking the nuclear agreement on the basis of the ballistic missile program. So I think that we have to be also realistic that Trump is not the only factor in an American foreign policy, and Iran is certainly violating the ballistics part of the nuclear deal. So in that way, Trump may be a wild card. America may become, or may be becoming, a unreliable partner to an extent. But that said, Trump is not the source of the problem, he's a symptom of a problem, and I think there are ways for us to reinvent the transatlantic relationship. I think the transatlantic relationship is considerably stronger than any president on either side of the Atlantic Ocean.
Okay, thanks. I think maybe Dr. Profazio, you want to address the third question?
Yeah, I also would
Or-
like to
or any other.
say something about
Absolutely.
the first question. I agree with you that we need to think about the cooperation between the northern Mediterranean and the southern Mediterranean. However, I'm afraid that we need a new model of cooperation between ourselves.
If you limit yourself just to paint on the facade, that's nothing.
Yeah, but at the
It's
same
just something that must change totally.
Yeah,
the way to
we need a
about
reset.
the relationship.
We need a reset because if you think about the northern Mediterranean, we already mentioned the tensions, for example, between France and Italy. But if we think about the southern Mediterranean, most of you know the Union pour le Maghreb Arabe, for example. How does it end? And what about the tensions between Algeria and Egypt over Libya? We had in May the Algeria military that put its air and ground force on alert after the Egyptian airstrikes in Libya because of the terrorist attacks in MENA. There is a complex story about that, but we have to bear in mind that these are the two most powerful armies in the African continent. And when we think about Libya, we have to always to remember that. So I think that probably we are not in the right moment of our history to think about traditional form of cooperations between the two parts of the Mediterranean. We need to think about a new approach. About Trump, I already said that his administration left Italy alone on Libya, in particular supporting the the government of national accord, and I agree with most of the things that the previous speaker said. The third question was about Italy's foreign policy and the stability in Libya. In this context, I would like to remind you that last year we mentioned three main drivers of Italy's foreign policy in Libya that are energy, counter-terrorism, and the fight against illegal immigration. Nothing has changed, and this shows us that Italy is still hostage to the policy of security in Libya. These are main security issues. But our attention has not focused on the political issue, which is the real problem. We have a Libyan political agreement that was signed in Skhirat that is about to expire probably in December. We had a constitution that was approved in July despite several irregularities. And we also had a commitment to hold elections. Which kind of elections? Is it possible to have elections in Libya in this moment? With this political instability and with the terrorist threat, ISIS is coming back and is taking advantage of the fact that the Libyan National Army and the Misrata militias are engaged in a dangerous standoff near Sirte. So I think that these main drivers of Italy's foreign policy are still hostage of a traditional approach that needs to be renewed.
Thank you very much. I think that you mentioned, I will take the two last questions and then I will turn off the floor to you. So thank you very much for mentioning, I think, what are the main drivers of Italy's foreign policy in Libya, and I think it's worth reminding ourselves of these main strategic interests and how they coordinate today. So I think we'll take two final public questions and then we will turn back the floor to the speakers, but as soon as we are done, you are more than welcome to stick around and speak individually to the speakers, as there will be a short reception for everyone, and you can say as long as you want. So we have a question there and another one there, and okay, let's do three. So the lady first, and then the two boys.
Thank you very much, and thanks for a very interesting introduction to all of you. I'm Margaret Skarpatek from the Norwegian Embassy. And I have one question on Libya. You mentioned the peace talks springtime, and I would like to to learn a little bit more about Italy's focus here, because I find that, you know, they focus not only on Sarraj and Haftar, but also on, for example, tribal leaders, and how can that influence on the situation, and could you elaborate a little bit more about this, especially in relationship to what you said regarding the security focus of Italy, what you just
Yes,
mentioned.
of course.
Thanks a lot. So, please, just
So-
try to be brief if you can.
You have said that there is that oftentimes Italy just follows the path of the European Union in terms of foreign policy, and that oftentimes there is a mismatch between Italian interest and European interest because of, say, northern countries not having a stake in the Mediterranean. What are the main points of not disagreement, but of divergence in interest between, say, the EU and Italy?
Another interesting question. Final question in the back.
Good afternoon, this is Angelico Yadans, the Middle East Analyst for Sacha. I have two questions actually, but we'll try to be very brief. The first one regards the impact on, or the possible evolution of the nuclear deal with Iran, especially from the European side and the foreign policy of Europe as a whole instead of Italy only. Especially given the sudden change on policy we had last year with the change in the White House. So what is, in your opinion, in the foreseeable future, the development of the nuclear deal with Iran? The second point regards the possible consequences after the removal, basically, of the ISIS from the region. Now that the world is going to its final stage, what are the possible effects, and in particular, how to handle with the possible, discriminating effects on this area? For example, in Iraq, in a few days we will have the referendum for the Kurdistan region. So how will it be managed, and what may be the consequences of action like this?
You said the removal of ISIS.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
The total removal of ISIS.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, and let me acknowledge Angelico that we are. I mean, if you can stick around in the reception later, Angelico will be one of the teacher of our online master, and he will making treasure of his work experience focusing on political risk in the MENA region. I thought I should say that. So I'll turn over the floor to the speakers. Maybe we start again from the ambassador, and then we will make our way back.
Briefly, because we are simply putting together the pieces of all of this problem. There are pieces lying around. There is no clear strategy or indication of the direction which we should be taking, etc. But some of the pieces have to be addressed for emergency purposes, but with a longer view. So we have the short view of immediacy and the longer view of the policy and the longer term policy. Libya was never a nation. We forget that. Even under the Ottoman Empire, Libya was not a nation. Algeria, nation, whatever, a coherent political entity. Libya was not. Libya was declared Libya as a unitary state in 1936, I think 25 years after the Italian occupation by the Italians. And after the war, it did not preserve. That's the problem I was mentioning. It does not exist as an interlocutor. Even Gaddafi, he was not president, he was not prime minister, he was leader. And he lived and he ran his country from the center, in between the two, from that area that is different. So even Gaddafi did not dare to establish a state, because it is that kind of a country where you have different tribes, leaders, strong men, etc., etc. It's still like that. It's always been like that. So I mean, even more so, we should not assume that anybody has destroyed the cohesiveness of that country. On the contrary, we did not succeed in promoting the unification of the country. The issue, or the broader issue, about establishing some kind of a coherent there's much talk about the Marshall Plan in the Middle East and with the Arabs, etc. I will remind you of two things. First of all, the Marshall Plan was set up by Foreign Secretary of State Marshall with the condition that the Europeans would cooperate among themselves and that the French and Germans would stop fighting each other as they had done for 3 times in 17 years. It was a conditionality. Now, when the Arab Spring came out, Mrs. Ashton and Füle, another commissioner in the European Union, established a program of assistance to the reform process that seemed to be happening in the Arab countries. And it was called, basically, it was called more for more. The more you do, the more the European Union will assist you in this process. The problem with the area, both the Northern Africa and the MENA, both Northern Africa and the Middle East, is that these countries have not been able to respond. There is a lack of responsiveness. And their responsiveness must be coherent among themselves, like the French and the Germans. You know, I'm not inventing things for the second, third time. I'm telling you what we have done in the European Union, what should be done anywhere else in the world. You have to cooperate among yourselves in order for the international community, including the European Union, to assist you. If you do it piecemeal, the European Union cannot work piecemeal. It does not work. It can give, of course, buy bananas and invest in infrastructures and things. Not bananas. It's the dates which I like particularly. And invest in infrastructure, but it's going to be a piecemeal thing. It's not going to create that community that we're talking about. We have the community in Europe. We're lacking an pan-Arab community on the left, and that is a critical problem. The difference of interest between Northern Europe and Southern Europe, frankly, I do not see that. I do not see differences. There are different responsibilities, different contiguities. I mean, some countries are more exposed than others, but the stabilization, the recomposition of the Arab world in general is a strategic interest for the world at large, Chinese included, because of obvious reasons. It is a wound in the international community, and therefore I think that the Norwegians have just as much interest in seeing the Italians do more about the problem, of course. And if something happens in the Baltic states, Italy will have an interest, national interest, in seeing that the Norwegians do something about the crisis, possible crisis in the Balkans. So I don't take it that differently. Finally, the Iran issue. The Iran issue was a 5+1.
Thank you.
So maybe we can, just before she leaves, thank you, Cinzia, very much. And I will take on the special role of being a speaker and a chair. Unless somebody wants to. Martina? You want to come be chair? Okay, please.
Briefly on Iran, you remember it was a 5+1 initiative. 5 members of the Security Council plus Germany, plus Mogherini, Ashton first and Mogherini afterwards, as a kind of observer, insurer, etc., etc. And it was, I think, the Americans accepted and respected this setup. It was Kerry who negotiated very hardly. It was basically an American-Iranian negotiation with the assistance of the other members of the Security Council, in particular Russia and China, because that issue of Iran was not a regional issue, but it was a worldwide United Nations stability, security concern. And therefore, the package was there. About the Middle East, obviously the final thing about its community, etc., we have forgotten that there was such a thing called the Quartet, dealing with the Middle East before Syria exploded, before even the Arab Springs, etc. The Quartet, which was composed of 2 international organizations, United Nations and Europe, and 2 states, Russia and the United States. Quite a strange combination, but a very important combination. It did not work. It did. Why? I mean, you had two institutions and two big boys there, ready to cooperate. But the reaction in the area, that is a problem that I always had. I had a problem. The reactiveness of our interlocutors was always insufficient, because they may have reacted individually, one country or the other, saying yes, well, but what is needed is a coherent, coordinated responsiveness to these international initiatives.
So I will focus just on two of the questions, well, obviously, because I'm not a specialist in Libya, but two parts of the questions as well. Italy and the EU, especially when you talk about the areas of divergence, I'll be very, very brief, because I think it's a huge question and a very important question, but we could do a 13-week lecture about that. But I would like maybe to say about what Europe is as a foreign policy actor, because Europe is kind of prioritized more normative power, civilian power, so to speak. And in a framework of civilian power, not only are we not fighting a war on terrorism, because what we're doing is we're doing counter-radicalization programs, or we're trying to look at the roots of the problem while not having necessarily to deal with its symptoms, whereas the individual states, not only Italy, but also Italy, are having to deal with both countering extremism and countering radical ideologies while fighting physically the war on terror. Europe as an entity can't do that. It doesn't have military capabilities, so it doesn't have the same vested interest. So Europe, you can say there's something called civilian power Europe that tries to develop civilian power approaches for foreign policy, and then the countries within Europe that have to deal with more realpolitik. So actually, the divergence of interest is going to be about the divergence of how nation states in Europe deal with their foreign policy, and in Italy's case, as being a peninsula inside of the Mediterranean, of course, naval security and protecting of the lines of communication over the sea is going to be very different, considerably different than landlocked countries, for example, in Northern Europe. So the Czech Republic may have a different approach, for example, about migration than Italy may. In fact, it's a very strange reflection. The Czech Republic has what Italy should have in terms of its approach to immigration. Italy is very open to immigration, whereas the Czech Republic is very closed to immigration, even though Italy experiences immigration much more than the Czech Republic does. But it's a different story, and that's why I think it's important maybe to have a longer period to talk about those differences. So please excuse me for just skipping over it. I would like to focus a little bit more about Iran and the nuclear deal, especially as it impacts Italian foreign policy. I think maybe we can put it into inverted commas as something like a reflection of the Khatami effect. If you remember that in the end of the 1990s, you had President Khatami, very modernizing president in Iran, and that followed Ahmadinejad, a very conservative politician in Iran. And so I think it's very important to keep in mind that the Iranian establishment and the way that the Iranian establishment works, the economy is not free. And so if you're investing in Iran, just like those who invested in Iran in the 1990s, sadly, you're going to get burned at a certain point. That's why a lot of SMEs who try and go to Iran at this point in time are coming back. They're not interested. Not because they can't go there, but because when they do go there, they're faced by bureaucratic hurdles and a lot of suspicion, because the people who are letting them into the economy are Revolutionary Guard. So it's not a free economy in which there's a trickle-down effect. It's an economy in which the ports and the contractors, the construction companies, everything is basically controlled by the Revolutionary Guard. So I know Sace is also thinking strategically in terms of their economy, in terms of their investments and working internationally. The problem, why you see major corporations and major companies going into Iran, but not very many SMEs, is because the SMEs don't have the breathing space. You don't have the ability of entering the space because of the scrutiny and because basically the economy is controlled by the Revolutionary Guard. So my understanding of how free the economy is becoming because of the nuclear deal and trying to bring Iran in, I think it's really, we're about to experience, just like we did under Khatami, we're going to see the bursting of the bubble, and very sadly, I think a lot of companies that have invested in Iran are going to be crying wolf later on and saying, why didn't you warn us? But of course, people are warning them. It's not a free economy. And I suspect that the next leader after Rouhani is once again going to close the country down, just like Ahmadinejad did after Khatami.
Who knows? In any case, Rouhani, the missile issue, for example, Rouhani is under pressure from the very same. So I mean, he has conceded on the warheads and is slower on the missiles. He has a domestic problem that he has to overcome as well.
Maybe it's as a last word, the president in Iran is not very important, and I think it's if you really want to know the extent to which Iran is serious about the nuclear deal, wait for the Grand Ayatollah to come out and sign it, or the Grand Ayatollah to fly to New York to make the announcement, not the president, because the president's authority is over running the government, not running the country.
Of course.
The country is run by Ayatollah Khamenei, and so until he's ready to sing the songs, not of death to America or whatnot, but until he's ready to address the international community, we can't be sure of the intentions of Iran.
Can I just quickly address the question from the Norwegian embassy? I think that we just need a little bit of more context. We are talking about the driver of Italy's foreign policy in Libya, that is the fight against illegal immigration. But we have to start from the memorandum of understanding that was signed in February by the Prime Minister Gentiloni and Sarraj to stem the flow of migrants of Mediterranean Sea. In March, this memorandum of understanding was suspended by the Court of Appeal in Tripoli, and this was a huge blow for Italy's foreign policy. Italy pursued a different approach because at the end of March, on 31st of March, Italy hosted a reconciliation agreement between 60 tribes of southern Libya that fought against each other. We can remember the Tebu, the Tuareg, and the Awlad Suleiman. This reconciliation agreement included, according to the press, I've never seen the agreement, a clause that was establishing a monitoring of the southern border in Libya that is taking effect in these days, in these weeks. I think that this was a solution that was found by the Interior Minister Marco Minniti to bypass the government of national accord, to bypass the ruling of the Court of Appeal in Tripoli, to negotiate directly with tribes in Libya. Well, this is really strange. Isn't strange that Italy's foreign policy is led by the Interior Minister? Isn't strange that the Italian government negotiated directly with tribes in Libya? It is something like the Norwegian government would like to negotiate directly with a city in Sweden. I found this a little bit more odd.
Yeah, please.
Just if it is possible to add this, what about the role of two actors that now somehow are proposing themselves as a potential intimidation factor? One is Kuwait, which is in the problem of Qatar, is becoming somehow a factor of intimidation between the parties. And the second factor is Russia, that was in a very big fight with Qatar for a long time, and down suddenly they reached an agreement on the exploitation of gas. And this is leading to a potential role of Russia again in the area. So I would like to understand, but these two factors, including the potential factor that is Italy, which is somehow in this low-profile international role, but it is always meaningful in this case because it's able this way to have a relation with everybody. Are they able to help somehow this process to go over a potential state of collaboration?
If I may, so I think Italy rightly, I think, especially in the Middle East, has practiced a policy of non-intervention. And if we really, I mean, they enjoy very good business relations, but Italy doesn't make demands on political change in many of the countries, which puts it into a good position on one level, but also not interested in engaging in the same way, for example, as Kuwait, and certainly not as Russia. And I also agree with you that Russia has had, deep crisis in many ways with Qatar. I should also maybe put this as personal reflection. Everybody's had a crisis with Qatar at some point. Whether we're talking about Luxembourg in their air aviation industry, or we're talking about, the city of London, everybody has had a crisis at a certain point in history with Qatar. But when it comes to Russia and Kuwait, you've struck a very important chord, because on one hand, Kuwait, as a GCC member, has spent a considerable amount of political energy trying to bring the two sides together in this issue. And many times I've heard people say, well, if Kuwait can stay out of it, and Oman can stay out of it, and Oman can engage with Iran if they want to, and Oman can do this, why can't Qatar? And the easy answer to that is that Oman, like Italy, doesn't get involved in other people's affairs. Qatar does. And so the reason why the countries have really focused on Qatar in this and not Oman is because Oman is free, like all the GCC countries are, to pursue whatever interest they want, as long as they don't interfere, with the domestic politics of the other GCC countries. Qatar is standing accused of that. Now, Kuwait has good offices in the sense that they are able to negotiate quite freely through all the other GCC countries. They're very well respected, but in fact, in this way, especially the three countries that are boycotting Qatar right now, they put forward their demands. Those demands could be negotiated, I'm sure, and I'm sure Kuwait is expending even more energy into the future trying to get these two sides to agree on some kind of compromise. I couldn't put myself in how stressful that must be for the Kuwaitis having to shuttle back and forth, but hopefully, as they say, inshallah, they'll get a breakthrough. Russia's negotiating tactics, of course, are considerably different. Russia is very active. The reason why it's able to communicate its position in Syria is because it's a military actor inside of Syria. And it's helped to turn the tide of battle against not only ISIS, but even against the secular opposition fighting against the Assad regime inside. And he's, Putin has basically thrown a lifeline and a safety preserver to the Assad regime. Assad would not have survived had Russia not gotten involved. And so Russia's, its negotiating position is not one of how do we create a balance within the region. They're basically saying, how do we consolidate the gains that we've won over the past years? And so what we're seeing with Russia's engagement, in contrast to Kuwait is genuinely interested in harmony of the region. Russia's interested in its gains in the region.
Very good.
Thank you.
No. I happen to agree with you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So I think we'll have to wrap up here. Though I'm not Cinzia Bianco, I'm Antonino, a junior researcher here at the EGIC. I will have to take the burden of closing this conference. Please do feel invited to sit around with us, have a chat or a fresh drink, to speak with us or with our panelists. Please also do consult our website, because we will have other upcoming events, such as the opening of the library, which will be free and consulted, as well as other events such as this one, and focusing on different aspects of intra-Gulf European relations. So before we can all dismiss, please give a big round of applause to our lovely panelists, Ambassador Guido, Lenzi, Professor Belfer, and Dr. Profazio. And please just feel free to join us for a drink or a chatter.
And
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. And if I may just say one last remark, not as a speaker anymore, but as putting on my other hat as the president of the association, we do a lot of events. We do events basically every 2 weeks, either here or outside in Rome, but also outside in the rest of Europe. And we're trying very hard for this month, next month for October, even the end of this month, to open up this space once or twice a week for people just to come in and to use our resources and our facilities, to use the library that we have that focuses on the Middle East, but also to use it as a space very close to the Spanish Steps. So please feel free to participate in any of our events. We're very happy to have you here. All of our publications, by the way, are free. Nikki can guide you to the area where you can freely take whatever publications we have. And all of our publications that are not only in print but also electronically are also open access. So feel free to read what we do and to participate in whatever actions that we have. I thank you very much for being here today. Please join us for a little snack, a little aperitivo if you would like. Also, it's very hot in this room. One of our air conditionings makes way too much noise and the other broke. Welcome to one of the oldest streets in Rome. It's bound to happen. By the way, this is the building of Pope Gregory, which is why the street is Via Gregoriana. So you're in a historical landmark. So please make yourself at home, and I look forward very much to welcoming you again. Thank you.
Thank you.